The light that woke Aoife was not the soft gray milk of an Irish dawn. It was a dirty, yellow shard that cut through the grime of a single window, a window that looked out not onto a field, but onto a wall of identical weeping brick. For a full minute, she lay still, the cacophony of the 5 Points tenement washing over her. It was a living thing, this building. It groaned with the weight of too many souls. Above her, a baby wailed with a thin, reedy terror. Below, a string of German curses was punctuated by the crash of a dropped pot. Somewhere in the hall, a man was coughing, a wet hacking sound that seemed to be turning his lungs inside out. She was in a room on the top floor of the tenement on Mulberry Street, a space perhaps 10 feet by 12, which she shared with 8 other people. Her bed was a patch of floorboards, a luxury afforded only because the landlady, a slatternly woman named Mrs. Mooney, had taken a liking to the last of Aoife's silver shillings. That shilling was now gone. Hunger. It was the old familiar companion, the gnawing hollow ache that had lived in her belly for 2 years. But here, it felt different. In Ireland, the hunger had been a shared shroud, a universal affliction sent by a silent God. Here, it was a personal failure. She sat up, her bones cracking in the damp cold. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and the ever-present sour reek of the privy in the yard. She pushed her tangled red hair from her face and looked at her hands. They were raw from the salt of the voyage, the nails broken. She had one thing left, a small muslin-wrapped bundle. Inside was her mother's wooden rosary and a single smooth stone from the beach at home. They were worthless. She got to her feet, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter. The other occupants of the room, a family of 6 huddled under one blanket, an old man who slept sitting up, were already stirring. No one spoke. Words were a luxury, and there was nothing good to say. Aoife slipped out the door and down the rickety stairs, her stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. She had to find work. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, now. The street hit her like a physical blow. The noise was a roar, iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, hawkers screaming about oysters and rags, the high-pitched shriek of a pig darting through the ankle-deep muck. The smell was worse, rotting vegetables, horse manure, coal smoke, and the metallic tang of the nearby slaughterhouses. She was drowning, suffocating in a sea of people. But they were not starving, not all of them. She passed a bakery. The window was fogged with steam, and inside, golden loaves were piled high. The sight of it made her dizzy. She saw a stout woman in a clean apron emerge, brushing flour from her hands. Aoife stepped forward, her voice a dry croak. "Please, ma'am, work. I can scrub. I can carry. Anything." The woman's eyes, the color of hard little currants, raked over Aoife. They took in the matted hair, the dirt-caked hem of her dress, and the faint, lingering smell of the ship. "Scrub?" The woman sniffed, her accent thick and German. "You look like you'd bring the filth in, not take it out. Get on. We've no room for your kind." The dismissal was like a slap. Your kind. She hadn't even spoken with her brogue, but it was written on her face, in her poverty. She stumbled on, the bakery's warm, yeasty breath following her like a taunt. This was the different hunger. It was not the simple, agonizing lack of food. It was the hunger to be seen as human. She walked for hours, from the chaos of Paradise Square to the waterfront. The forest of masts at the docks reminded her of the leafless trees back home, a forest of the dead, Here, men swarmed like ants, hauling, shouting, cursing. She approached a foreman, a burly man with a face like a boiled ham. "Work, sir?" He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed perilously close to her foot. "This ain't no place for a girlie. Go on before you get yourself crushed, and tell your brothers and your da we got all the mix we need." She felt a hot, prickling shame. It was worse than the hunger. It was a cold, creeping poison. She turned away from the docks and moved toward the more respectable, cleaner streets north of Canal. Here, the houses were tall and narrow, built of proud red brick with iron railings and polished knockers. She saw women in fine dresses stepping from carriages, their skirts held fastidiously away from the street. In her desperation, she found a side entrance, a servants' alley. A cook, her arms dusted with flour, was beating a rug over a line. "Excuse me," Aoife said, trying to sound respectable, trying to iron the lilt from her voice. "I'm looking for work, as a maid, or in the scullery. I'm strong and I learn fast." The cook paused, looked her up and down, and for a moment Aoife felt a flicker of hope. The woman's gaze was not unkind. "You're new, aren't you? Fresh off the boat?" "Aye," Aoife whispered. "The mistress is looking for a girl," the cook said, sighing, "but not an Irish girl. I'm sorry, child. The last one," she said, "stole a silver spoon." She lowered her voice. "And, well, the master of the house, he prefers the German girls. They're quieter." Quieter, cleaner, more reliable. Not Irish. The words became a drumbeat. She went to a tailor's shop, a tobacconist's, a laundry, and at 3 of them she saw it. A small, neatly lettered sign in the window, tacked up as casually as a notice for lost gloves. "No Irish need apply." The first time she saw it, she simply stared, the letters blurring. It was a lock on a door she hadn't even known existed. The second time, it felt like a brand on her skin. The third time, a cold, hard rage began to smolder beneath the fear. In Ireland, she was Aoife ní Briain, daughter of Owen, from a village that had stood for 1,000 years. She was a person. Here she was a category, a problem, a pest. The sun, a weak, watery disk, was beginning to sink, painting the filthy air a bruised purple. The cold was deepening, seeping into her bones. The hunger was no longer a knot. It was a roaring, dizzying void. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She found herself back in the labyrinth of the 5 Points, her last desperate hope draining away. She had failed. She had survived the blight and the fever ship, only to starve on a street paved with gold. She leaned against a damp wall, the world tilting. She saw men stumbling from a grog shop, their faces slack. She saw children barefoot and skeletal, picking through a heap of oyster shells, their movements sharp and feral like rats. This was her future. This was her end.
The voice was rough, laced with the familiar music of home. Aoife opened her eyes. It was Mrs. Mooney, the landlady, her arms crossed over her prodigious bosom. Her sharp, calculating eyes missed nothing. I can't find work," Aoife whispered, the admission tearing at her pride. No one will have me." "Of course they won't," Mrs. Mooney said, not unkindly. "Look at you, you're a drowned thing. And you're asking in the wrong places. The respectable folk, they don't want us, girl, not unless we're quiet as mice and twice as clean." She put a beefy hand on Aoife's shoulder. "But you're a pretty thing beneath the grime, a good bit of bone in your face, And that hair like a fire. Men pay for that. Aoife recoiled, a cold dread far worse than starvation clamping around her heart. What do you mean? Mrs. Mooney gestured with her head toward a brightly lit building across the square. It was a dance hall. Even from here she could hear the tinny frantic sound of a fiddle and coarse laughter. She had seen the girls who went in and out, their faces painted with bright, hectic spots of rouge, their eyes ancient. I mean, Mrs. Mooney said softly, that there's more than one way to fill your belly. There's work, and then there's work. A girl like you wouldn't have to be cold again. You'd have a bed. You'd eat meat every day. Eat, a bed, warmth. The words were a siren song. Aoife's stomach cramped so violently she doubled over. She thought of the bakery window, the golden bread. She thought of the cold floor of the tenement. Mrs. Mooney's voice was a warm, cozening whisper in her ear. It's not so bad, girl. It's just a job. Better than scrubbing another woman's floors, eh? Better than starving. Starving's a sin when you've a gift God gave you. Aoife looked up, her vision blurred. She saw the painted, hollow-eyed girls. She saw the leering men. And suddenly, she saw her mother, her face worn with prayer and worry, kneeling by the hearth. She saw her brother Liam, his eyes bright with fever before he died, clutching her hand. We are not animals, her father had said, in the last days when they were eating boiled seaweed. We do not just survive, we live. Remember who you are. A different hunger surged up in her, a hunger so fierce it eclipsed all else. It was the hunger for herself, the one thing they hadn't taken. No, Aoife said, her voice shaking but suddenly clear. No, Mrs. Mooney's face hardened, the false warmth vanishing. Don't be a fool, girl. Pride's a cold bedfellow. I'll not, Aoife said, pushing herself off the wall. She was trembling from head to foot, but she stood straight. I'll not. I'd rather starve in the street. Suit yourself, the landlady sneered, her lip curling. But you'll not starve on my floor. I'll have the shilling for tonight, or you're out. I don't have it. Then you're out, now. Mrs. Mooney grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the tenement door. Get your things, and don't come back till you've coin. Her things took 30 seconds to gather, the rosary and the stone. She clutched them in her hand and stumbled back down the stairs, cast out. The street was dark now. The gas lamps cast pools of sickly, wavering light. The air was colder, with a sharp, wet edge that promised frost. She was truly, utterly alone. No home, no money, no hope. She walked until her legs gave out, collapsing into a narrow, dark alleyway between a tannery and a crumbling warehouse. The stench of lye and rotting hides was overwhelming, but she was too weak to care. She curled into a ball, pulling her shawl over her head, and began to shiver. This was it. This was the end. The hunger was a cold, peaceful numbness now. She closed her eyes. It would be easy to just sleep, to let the cold take her. A boot nudged her, hard, in the ribs. Oi, get up. Aoife groaned, looking up into a face that seemed to be carved from hardwood. It was an old woman, bent and ancient, but her eyes were sharp and black as coal. She was wrapped in a mountain of rags and carried a large, bulging sack. This ain't a flop house, the woman rasped, her brogue thicker than Aoife's, a pure stony thing from the west of Ireland. You die here, the peelers will just kick you into the gutter. Let me be, Aoife wept, the tears freezing on her cheeks. I've nowhere to go. The old woman stared at her for a long, hard moment. She saw the face, the youth, the particular shade of despair that was not yet resignation. You're one of Mooney's, ain't you? Aoife nodded. She offer you the dance hall? Aoife nodded again, shamefaced.
And you said no. It wasn't a question. You're a fool, but not a whore. That's something. The old woman sighed, a sound like grinding stones. Get up, girl, get up, or I'll kick you again. Aoife, shocked, scrambled to her feet. The old woman's name, she would learn, was Biddy. She was a tosher, a scavenger, one of the countless phantoms who lived in the city's cracks. You're coming with me, Biddy grunted, already moving. I have a space, but you'll earn it. Biddy's space was not a room. It was a hovel, a lean-to of scrap wood and tar paper, built in a back court, pressed against the warm brick of a chimney stack. It was tiny and foul-smelling, but it was out of the wind. Biddy lit a small stub of a candle, illuminating a nest of rags. You sleep there. You don't snore, and you don't steal. You steal from me, she said, showing a row of brown, broken teeth. I'll cut your throat while you sleep. I won't, Aoife promised, her teeth chattering. Biddy rummaged in her sack and produced a hard black heel of bread and a small wrinkled apple. She broke the bread in two, handing the larger piece to Aoife. Aoife ate. She had never tasted anything so magnificent. The stale, gritty bread was life itself. It was strength. It was tomorrow. In the morning, Biddy said, settling into her own nest of rags, we work. What work? Aoife asked, the last of the bread gone. The linens, Biddy said, her eyes already closing. The big houses on the square. They want their sheets white, whiter than snow. She gave a short, barking laugh. They send them to us. The next morning, before dawn, Biddy led her to a vast, steaming basement, a cellar that ran beneath 3 houses. It was a vision of hell. Dozens of women, their faces slick with sweat and their arms red to the elbow, stood over massive steaming tubs. The air was so thick with lye and bleach that it burned Aoife's lungs. The noise of the mangles and the pounding of wet clothes was deafening. You, a foreman yelled, pointing at Aoife. You're with Biddy. You carry. You scrub. The work began. The linens were heavy, soaked with water and filth. She hauled them from the delivery wagons, her back screaming. She plunged her hands into the scalding, caustic water, and within an hour her skin was raw and blistering. By noon, her hands were bleeding. She didn't stop. She scrubbed alongside Biddy, her world reduced to the rhythmic, agonizing scrape of the brush, the steam, the pain. The other women were shadows, gaunt and silent, their faces locked in grim concentration. This was a hunger of a different kind. It was the hunger of the machine. The city demanded white linens, and it fed on the hands of the Irish to get them. Late in the day, she was sent to fetch a new load. She staggered into the alley, her arms feeling as if they were being pulled from their sockets, the huge wicker basket cutting into her shoulder. The cold air was a relief. She paused, leaning against the wall just to breathe. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and powerful. It cut through the city's din. She looked across the street into the glowing maw of a blacksmith shop. A man, his back a mountain of muscle under his shirt, was hammering a piece of glowing iron on an anvil. Sparks flew, illuminating his face, which was set in deep concentration. He was not Irish. He was big, blond and bearded. A German, she guessed. He was not scrubbing. He was not hauling. He was not serving. He was making. He was taking a dead, cold piece of metal, and with fire and his own strength, beating it into something new, a horseshoe, a tool, a thing of purpose. Aoife stood mesmerized. The pain in her hands, the ache in her back, the sting of the lie, all of it faded for a second. The clang of the hammer was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It sounded like defiance. "Girl, move yourself!" The foreman's voice bellowed from the basement. Aoife flinched, tearing her eyes away from the forge. She hoisted the heavy basket, the wicker digging into her raw skin. She turned her back on the glowing light and descended once more into the steam, the shadow, and the suds. The hunger was still there, sharp and aching, but as she scrubbed, a new burning ember settled in her heart. It was a different hunger still, not just for bread, not just for dignity, but for the fire. The hunger to make, not just to endure, the hunger for the forge.